Hello and welcome. Thanks for tuning in to this presentation about EquityWorks, brought to you by CivicLab. My name is Dakota Palicki. I'm a director at CivicLab. We're a nonprofit institute dedicated to helping teams and partnerships solve complex social challenges. Part of my job is to support the National Talent Network, a group of nearly 100 cross-sector partnerships in the United States that collaborate to improve education and talent outcomes for the places they call home. Every other month, the National Talent Network gathers to learn about new initiatives, tools, and resources. In January of 2023, we came together to learn about EquityWorks, a bold systems-level initiative to make Columbus, Indiana, the most equitable community for youth by 2030. Today, you're going to hear from Jack Hess, CivicLab's executive director, as he discusses what they've been learning, what EquityWorks is doing to reach their moonshot goal, and the progress that they've made to date. Before we get in, I just want to say thank you for listening in. If you want to learn more about EquityWorks, join the National Talent Network, or just learn about how CivicLab can support your community by using census tract data, systems building frameworks, and stakeholder engagement, just send me an email. We'd be delighted to serve your partnership. And with that, here's Jack to share more about EquityWorks.
As Dakota said, I'm Jack Hess with CivicLab. We're based out of Columbus, Indiana, and it's my great pleasure today to really help kind of give an overview about pursuing equity through systems change and an overview about the EquityWorks initiative. First of all, I just want to say hello on behalf of the entire CivicLabs team, who is well represented here on the call today. Good to see you, John. John was instrumental in the vision that you're about to see as we co-founded CivicLab together. Thanks, Amber, for the back-end support you're providing today and all the support you provide as a backbone organization to this initiative. And thanks, as always, Dakota, for hosting this and extending the offer and the opportunity. EquityWorks is something that takes place in this place, in the state of Indiana, in Bartholomew County, in the actual city of Columbus, Indiana, not Ohio, but Indiana. As you can see, it's about 45 miles southeast of Indianapolis. It sits in what they call the triangle between Indianapolis, Cincinnati, and Louisville. Right off Interstate 65, and it's a county of about 82,000 people itself. And for full disclosure, CivicLab is the backbone kind of support organization for the initiative that we're going to review. And today I'm going to try to address three particular questions. Number one, what are we learning? Here, I'm going to try to provide some national research, and not only what we kind of learned from that research, but what we've learned about ourselves in the process of looking at our community in a new and different way. The second question is, what are we doing? It's one thing I know to look at data, but what are we doing about it? And here I'm going to talk about an ambitious community-wide moonshot that really involves a vision for change using an equity lens, but also what does it mean to actually take a systems approach is what we'll try to actually address toward that question. And then finally, how are we doing? And I'm proud to say there's some early stage results that we have to share at the conclusion to kind of, I think, track progress, and even how we kind of track progress on something I think is complicated and at once complex as equity. So those are our three questions and our three parts. So as promised, part one, what are we learning? About 7 years ago, many people within our community actually were all coming into the realization of this body of research at the national level. The actual research project was called the Opportunity Atlas, and it was primarily developed as a responsibility of this individual. This is Raj Chetty. He's probably one of the brightest young economists of his class and of his generation in the US. He runs an initiative called Opportunity Insights out of Harvard University, and his family immigrated from India. And due to part of that kind of upbringing, he was always fascinated about the American dream, and especially the prospects for upward economic mobility. So as he got into his degree and started to go to work as a practitioner in economics, Raj noticed something kind of unusual, though, about this facet of the American dream. And that is, since really the end of World War II, only half of our children today actually grow up to earn more than their parents. And that's been a pretty consistent trend since 1940, well into the 80s. And today that number is actually below 50%, or below half of that. And so that intrigued Raj, needless to say, about this is an important facet or fabric of the actual American dream itself, but how could it be trending in this particular direction? The other thing Raj heard about is a lot of upward economic mobility actually comes from the conditions in which you were actually raised in from a child. And a lot of research began pointing more and more that way, that the place you live now has less and less of effect as we get older, but the place you were born and raised had a tremendous effect. I don't know if you know this or not, I certainly didn't, but in the 90s, the US government actually provided vouchers in actually 5 US cities to thousands of families to actually move to actual census tracts that had poverty rates below 10%, and then track that progress for the children up to age 35, at which time they looked at their average actual income. That's on the kind of vertical axis, and the horizontal axis is actually the age of the child when the parents actually moved. And similar to early brain development, the earlier a child moved to a better set of conditions in a neighborhood, in this case, it was Seattle Central's district, as opposed to Shoreline district themselves, it had substantial quantitative, I think, increase in a child's annual income by many, many thousands of dollars. But every single year that that child spent in the Seattle-centric district, that actually began to fall and drop. And by the age and the time that the child was actually 23 years of old, most of those effects were actually done and had been mitigated back. So the obviously policy implication here for Raj is, well, let's don't move children, but let's see how we can improve the conditions and circumstances within our own communities themselves. And so Raj began what arguably may be one of the largest research projects ever taken, especially on youth. They looked at every child born through 1978, 1983, that 5-year period. That's 20.3 million American children, or 96% of all children in that area. And to kind of cut to the chase, somewhat surprising, somewhat not, they did find a strong correlation between the neighborhood in which a child grows up having substantial effects on his or her prospects of upward income mobility. And to visualize and help people see this, they created the Opportunity Atlas. This is showing median household income by the time children were 35 years old. That kind of bluish color represents the higher incomes, and that kind of red or darkish rust color represents some areas of some of the lower incomes of the children. But there's something very special about this map. This wasn't the 35-year-olds where they lived when they actually took the measurement. They took the income at them 35, but then placed them back where the children actually were born and raised, into the communities in which the conditions brought kind of forth the results and the outcomes that Raj was actually measuring. So it's kind of a weird time machine. You can obviously see big time macro effects across the country as a whole. But no matter what location you actually look in, whether it's our own county of Bartholomew County, you see variation. Whether it's a more urban area like Indianapolis, you see even greater variation. Places like Manhattan and Brooklyn have wide variances and deviations, but even rural communities like our friends out in Shasta, California, primarily agricultural in terms of its environment, have very similar kinds of patterns of inequities and variances in their area. Wherever you looked, you just kind of saw this pattern. This was the household income for Bartholomew County when our community started to look at the data. And remember, this is outcomes of our kids actually put back into the neighborhoods in which they were born and raised. And what Raj found is there was a tight correlation between the neighborhood and upward economic mobility. In fact, that correlation was hyperlocal, as he called it, 0.6 of a mile. That 0.6 of a mile radius was predictive of such things as income, upward mobility, poverty, educational attainment. But once you got out of that 0.6 of a mile, that effect of predictability began to fall off drastically. So there's a real tight correlation to what we normally think in terms of conditions. They're hyperlocal and they're super tight. In fact, there are areas that you see obviously strong correlations on many variables, not just household income, but the fraction of single parents, which, by the way, had one of the strongest correlations to upward economic mobility. But here's the actual, I think, kind of surprising thing from Raz's research. It's not the direct effect of your parents' marital status. He found the strongest correlation was actually at community level factors that are somehow associated with the fraction of single parents in an area that's predictive of kids' outcomes. So it's actually the fraction of single parents in that 0.6 of a mile, not necessarily your own household condition that was predictive of outcomes. I think that's surprising to a lot of people, but also reassuring that there are important community level factors and things that we can do as communities to actually change the conditions when it comes to equity and when it comes to upward economic mobility. Another surprising thing, especially from someone kind of out of the economic development world, there was no association whatsoever to actual job growth and upward mobility for children. In fact, if anything, there may have been a negative correlation. If you look on the horizontal axis, those are the places that created and had experienced the greatest amount of job growth over the 20-year period from 1990 to 2010. And yet, as a cohort in that quadrant, they also experienced the least amount of upward mobility for their children itself. In many cases, these places imported in talent themselves in order to make their economies tick and hum, but at the same time didn't do a lot to address local conditions for the youth and the families that actually lived there. And the data proves that out. A booming economy, in other words, doesn't always lead to greater upward mobility for children. So there leads another really interesting part of this research, that there are factors in the development of human capital may differ from those that lead to productive labor markets, which have been the primary focus for urban economics for over 50 years. In other words, there's another really important role for communities to play, the development of human capital that's outside of those values that come from actually just growing the economy. If you kind of put that together, Roz found kind of 6 factors that are instrumental in mobility outcomes for youth. One, cities that are more segregated by any variable, race or income, actually tend to have worse outcomes for people of all racial and ethnic groups, not just those experiencing the segregation directly. So all people's outcomes are actually lower themselves. The more segregation is actually prevalent in a community. 2, upward mobility is less common in places that have a smaller middle class. There's a strong association between upward mobility and family structure. As we said earlier, again, not your family, but the overall presence of single families within 0.6 of a mile. Places with high levels of social capital, there's that word again, tends to have higher levels of upward mobility. Places that have better schools have better rates. And then there's also factors of independent effect outside of actual place-based effect. And the big one Roz pointed out, of course, is race. And he said we shouldn't think of neighborhoods as just being one set of factors that applies to everyone equally. It may be important to design policies that are specifically targeted toward subgroups that directly address particular challenges that they face. So at the end, some people asked Raj in many interviews, so is the American dream dead? Is it alive today or not? And he said something I think pretty profound. He said, I think the question itself may be actually ill-posed. American dream, we should really think of an Iowa dream or the Atlanta dream or the California dream, because there's so much variation within the United States. And so as a community, we really asked, so what is the Columbus dream? What could it be and what should it be? And we knew equity was an important part of that equation. But before we could answer that question, we had another more critical question we had to address, was just how fair and equitable is Bartholomew County overall? So here we kind of began our trek by thinking of this bridge. This is the Robert Stewart Bridge. It goes over the East Fork of the White River in town. These cars are coming from the west side of our community into the downtown itself. And the reason why I show you this bridge and this river is most census tracts themselves are actually delineated by roads and also rivers. And that would certainly be the case with this body of water itself. In fact, this river actually separates Census Tract 109 from Census Tract 101. Now, I know that doesn't mean a lot to you, but here's the bridge on a flat map. And here are the cars coming in from the west side, Census Tract 109, making the way across that bridge into the downtown in 101. And when those cars cross that bridge, it might as well be as if they're entering a completely different world. because the world they're actually entering into has about a 23% poverty rate, $37,000 in median income, an educational attainment rate below 30%, and a life expectancy of about 71 years. But the 109, which is only 2 miles away as the crow flies, actually has a 4% poverty rate, 104,000 in median income, 80% educational attainment rate, and a life expectancy of 83 years. In other words, you, your youth, or your families almost lose 11 years of their life and a tremendous amount of overall economic wealth and upward mobility just by traveling 2 miles over that kind of very short bridge area. But those weren't the only inequities. There are 15 census tracts. I'll define that term more here in just a moment within Bartholomew County. And here we kind of looked at the ones that are in green above the national average on those 4 metrics. Yellow means they're generally at the national average for those kind of indicators. And red shows usually lower, vastly lower than the national averages themselves. But fates and fortunes can change sometimes, even when just a few blocks themselves, as we would soon learn. When you take those 15 census tracts and you stack them from highest to lowest, we realize there was a 20% variation in the poverty rate among those tracts themselves. For youth, the number was even more dismal. That number was a 42% poverty rate for those youth below the age of 18. We also learned that our educational attainment rate varied by nearly 60% among those census tracts themselves. With Illumina goals to try to get adults at 60%, we have a 60% variation among those 15 areas within the county. The median income is about variance from high to low, about $66,000 difference. Now remember that number, we'll come back to it, 66,000. Variance between the census tracts, and the life expectancy from the north part of the county to the center core of the county is nearly several decades, 17.3 years difference in your life expectancy with our very own county itself. The other thing that we learned is the fact that we were looking at data at a county level and at a city level. And we learned that that's hiding a lot of different kinds of variables that was kind of invisible to us previously. And I think the poverty rate's a good illustration of that. Before COVID, the United States had a poverty rate of about 13.1%. Bartholomew County, I'd say a few percentage points better than that at about 10 and a half. But I think the important thing to realize is when you're using this kind of aggregated data, they're not only aggregated, they're averages of averages. And so the important point is in no census tract of the 15 is 10.6% the rate, anywhere obviously even close to that. If you kind of look at the 15 tracts again, and again, remember 10.6% is the unemployment rate, you'll find a low in some tracts of 3%, a high of nearly 23%. And again, the picture is much more complicated for youth. There are some tracts where youth actually live in a 42% poverty rate. And then just 1 mile away and one census tract over, the rate for youth is 0. So just by going a very, very short amount of distance, you can see the rate change drastically between families and different parts and different areas. Again, averages kind of hide all of these variations and all these differences. So using aggregated data, we realized was hiding a lot of what we were looking for. We realized that Bartholomew County is not one homogeneous place, but it's 15 different kind of ecosystems. And we kind of had to wrap our mind around that. And the important thing about ecosystems is actually trying to achieve some balance on that. But we actually asked ourselves, using the tract level data, thanks to Raj, would we create different interactions in different places? And we thought the answer is, I think we would, and I think we could. And more importantly, we decided we think we should. And so that kind of started our journey on that, about what we were learning using kind of this idea that Raj Chetty kind of put into our thought process and what we were able to learn about ourselves. But also it kind of gave us some direction forward about part 2, about what we're doing, about what it is we learned. The first thing we did is we decided we were going to create a moonshot, kind of based on the John F. Kennedy putting a person on the moon by the end of the decade. We thought this was an important, ambitious thing to get the focus and I think the attention that this kind of work actually needed if we were going to do systems change. So several years ago, we put in place the 2030 moonshot by the end of the decade. How could Columbus, Indiana become the most equitable community for children in the nation? And then we had to figure out, well, what does that mean? How might we assess it? And how might we actually determine whether or not we're making progress toward that goal? We put together an initial guiding team, which were representative of the 9 largest systems that actually represent youth and families in our area, as well as some really important supporting partners from IU for data. CivicLab became the backbone, the city and our community foundation as important resource partners. And we went to work, meeting every 2 weeks for the last nearly 3 years now as a group and a team. We decided if we could figure out what it is we could actually do together to make our way toward that moonshot. One thing we knew very early on is it wasn't going to be any one thing. And so we really convinced ourselves there's going to have to be changes in systems, changes in the way we work together and get ourselves as best aligned as we could. And that was important. But also, thanks to Raj Chetty and some of the research we showed you, that's not enough. We actually also had to get better at place-based strategies and support. We had to change the actual conditions in different places in different ways. And then the last part, there are still, as we saw from Raj Chetty's work, there are still people who are situated in these neighborhoods and in these systems differently. And those needs actually needed to be targeted. And we need to come up with specific subgroup strategies for particular folks in different places of the system itself. So which lever are we going to pull? Well, we have to pull all 3 of those levers. And so we call this the layer cake. And we've kind of been working a number of strategies and approaches within each of these. And I'm just going to share a couple in each of the layers, starting kind of with the system building support. Here, our mantra was, it's a systems thing, not a single thing. And we actually have to figure out constantly the question of how can we strengthen our relationships and our alignments as systems that serve youth and families the best as we can. CivicLab provided an engagement process that we've been using even much prior before this work for several decades, almost 25 years now, right, John, in the work that we've actually done. But what makes it, I think, important to know, it's a relationship-based systems building approach. It's not a programmatic problem-solving approach. It's very, very different. It's always asking not the question, how do we solve the problem? It's always asking the question, how might we strengthen our relationships to actually improve the outcomes and the human condition? Its ground rules are pretty easy. When you're using the process, you're not to do anything to people, and it's not even good enough to help and do things for people, but the process can only be applied in a co-creative spirit with people themselves. And so that's the process that the guiding team undertook. And for us, we really realized that that process is our product. And there had to be integrity to it. And we had to make sure we were living up to those values if we were going to ask anyone else to engage. Now, the systems element, that's the relationship component. We use a very simple window just to keep our conversations focused on the system, because it's so easy to slip back to programmatic efforts. So this window at the bottom is about programs to the left or systems to the right. And then on the left axis, it's asset-based at the top and deficit-based below. And then to the left axis, it's more about relationships versus resources themselves. And we want to strengthen the relationships because those, like a muscle, get stronger the more we use them. And then finally, across the top, not just solving problems themselves, but redesigning systems by swimming upstream of youth and seeing if we can actually dissolve problems within the system itself. And a pretty good day for us, as we always used to kind of joke, is when we achieve systemness, which is this quality where you find yourself in this upper quadrant. And you're thinking about systems and wholes, you're focused on relationships in an asset-based way, and you're trying to dissolve systemically problems rather than just solve them themselves. This isn't easy to keep in this box. And I can't tell you how many times this box paper came out for people who wanted to kind of make sure the conversation was heading in the right way. But it was a real way of making sure that when we were together, we were focused on the right conversation that we wanted to have, one that kept us at the systems level. All the partners went back. Many of them rewrote their strategic plans using what we were learning together, not only about the research and what actually creates more equitable opportunities, but also about the data that we were now kind of looking at together. So our school corporation rewrote their entire strategic plan around accessibility, including for pathway development. Our juvenile justice system decided that they were going to try to move from a deficit-based reactive support services, and that's their own words, and actually flip the whole model on actually its head and actually try to become an asset-based preventative system. I mean, they used to be named the Juvenile Detention Center. So they knew they had a lot of work to do. So the first thing they did is they changed their whole focus. Youth and Family Community Connections became the moniker and the name. They established a set of guiding principles that we were so impressed with that EquityWorks just adopted at its own, because it's a perfect blend of asset-based development as well as trauma-informed care that had been crosswalked very carefully with the participants in that area. And they added a tremendous amount of prevention and connections and support elements, turning really the entire system kind of upside down about how people thought about it, but more importantly, where they put their energies, their focus, and their resources. We have just a blessed coalition called the Council for Youth Development. You can see at the top, their concerns are our concerns as a community, and that they were looking at the data and really rewrote their entire kind of collaborative plan, what's called the Youth Master Plan, for all the youth serving agencies together, using that data that we were collectively looking at as really the focus and the forefront of that. This coalition surveys every single kid every 2 years from middle school into high school, and it's all based on the youth perception of the assets they think they have that they're getting in school, but also the assets they think they're gaining from the community itself. And so this is a tremendous thousands of survey responses from our youth, giving their direct perceptions into where we need improvements and how we as a community can actually develop more assets among them. And this may be the funnest and most important thing we did. We actually put in place a set of youth ambassadors. And these youth ambassadors were instrumental in telling us what kinds of programs and services they wanted, what kinds were being effective, and where we should put more of our energy in terms of the way we bring about systems and develop the neighborhoods in which these young leaders lived and were nurtured and grew up. And we always called this an important thing. We got to give more voice and choice to the beneficiary. And that was precisely why we put these individuals together and gave them a voice at the table in which we were all working. And then some great work that Amber Fishvote helped us do. We tried to figure out how are we actually going to determine whether or not we have equitable accessibility in all these systems, because they're very different. But using, again, the guiding team, she really led an effort about the 7 dimensions of equitable access, a simple one-page front and back assessment tool that any organization can actually use to begin to ask the question how accessible we are to youth and families. Each one of the 7 colored blocks also goes down to its own page itself if an organization would like to take a deep dive in a particular dimension of access itself. So it's very user-friendly. It creates a new conversation. And after today, we're providing access for all of you here on the line to that actual tool itself. But it was critical for us for helping us assess the dimension. We want outcomes, yes, but we have to ensure equitable access first before we start looking kind of at that latter part of the system. So it was a big body of work, but it's been extraordinarily successful in creating many new conversations among youth serving and family serving organizations. This middle part, some exciting new work here about place-based strategies. And the mantra basically here was where you live shouldn't determine your outcomes and full potential in life. And you already saw that that is kind of the case in Bartholomew County. And that's what we really got together to kind of address. We partnered with our university. I can't say enough about for all of you and your coalitions. I know you have great university partners. For us, it was Indiana University and Dr. George Towers shown here, who really helped us, visualize diversity. Most of the maps you see was created by this man. 2, helping us understand the spatial dimensions of equity and diversity, which are extraordinarily important, and ultimately trying to help us craft strategies so we could advance social equity in the community. So his insights were critical for us in looking at this data in a new way. For those of you who don't know, crash course in 30 seconds for census data. Raj Chetty was showing you census tracts. There are 15 of those in Bartholomew County. If you look at the 15 different colors, those are the tracts. But then within the country, including yours, all tracts are divided into census block groups. And there's usually 2, 3, or 4 block groups within each kind of block group area, or tract rather. A tract is normally about 5,000 people, and a block group is usually about 1,000, maybe to 1,500. So you're talking about going from 5,000 individuals from the colors down to about 1,000 individuals for the actual lines that you see there. So the maps you see coming forward now from this point on will be done at the block group level. And I think you'll see why that's important in just a moment. This was really critical for us trying to understand just where are youth and where are families themselves, and in terms of where they spatially situated within the county. It was also great to look at poverty in new and different ways, and how vast that particular poverty rate can change just within a few streets or even a few neighborhoods. But it also, for those in educational attainment on the line, it really showed us where our educational attainment gaps were neighborhood by neighborhood. The light yellow on here kind of represents neighborhoods that only have 5 to 16% with a high school diploma or less, where the darker orange colors are nearly 70 to 90% of those individuals living in there have a high school diploma or less. So needless to say, it provides profound focus if you're really going to go out and actually start to make some impact on these areas. A lot of variables. There's over 200 variables on the American Community Survey, which is what we use from the Census Bureau. That's kind of mind-boggling. So Dr. Towers actually decided we would go on a data framework using the Kids Count Index. I know many of you are very familiar with this, but the thing we were going to try to do is Kids Count currently through the Annie Casey Foundation usually restricts access at the county level or at the major metropolitan statistical area level. We wanted to get it down to the neighborhood level. So the amazing thing that George was actually able to have us do was to crosswalk the kids count components around economic, educational well-being, and health. In just a minute, you'll see families and community, and crosswalk all of that data, all of those things to the American Community Survey, where you can actually get block group levels. You'll notice some of these are one-to-one. Other these are proxies for other indicators themselves. I put this on here for you really data geeks, so you'll kind of have the crosswalk to kind of see what we did. But for others, just know we were able to take the kids count components and put them into another database or cross-reference it with another database to get down to even more hyper local levels of access. So here's an example. If you go today to Annie Casey Foundation's Kids Count data, I go to my county, Bartholomew, and I said, tell me what you can about median household income in Indiana, and specifically Bartholomew County. There it is. There's the state. There's the legend. And they found out about $70,545 is median household income. Okay. But what George Towers was able to help us do is to take this look at the county. Here are the actual 59 census block group neighborhoods, and showing you the median household income for those particular neighborhoods. And let me try to show you why I think this is important, because if we start to zoom into the city center, and I'm going to zoom just a little bit north now near the airport, there are a lot of places on this map where you'll see kind of this light color come into this dark orange color itself, where there's extraordinary variation between something that's literally footsteps away and sometimes just bordering 1 or 2 streets. In this case, in that dotted line, the actual census neighborhood is about $40,000 at the top of the box and $141,000 of annual median income at the bottom, from just a few roads of variation or difference. So if you're using census block group data, remember I told you before, if you're using tract level data, the variation 66,000. When you actually look at the range among block groups themselves, the actual range of difference is more than $133,000 of difference from one neighborhood to the next. Again, kind of showing the importance of looking at data. Whatever level you look at the data, you get a different answer. There's obviously also a component here that's nice. By using the kids counts framework, we're able to actually take 10 variables across 4 components, and you'll see them to the left: economic, education, health, and then family and community. And then actually begin to look at those 4 components on one map, on one picture itself. And you can kind of see how it works from the top left index, the well-being index for children. The bluish tones going from light to darker kind of tell you it's average to high. And the orangish tones, again, starting kind of the lower to the darker intensity, go more the lower. So the darker the orange on the map are the ones that actually are the lowest ranking on all 4 of those components: economic, education, health, and family and community themselves. So the amazing potential to help us prioritize where we actually began to focus a lot of our efforts from some of these indices was important. But 2, just being able to assess how are we doing relative to our county, but also relative to the nation, because remember, it's a nationwide vision that we're trying to pursue, was invaluable. And it was kind of the answer to our question: how do we know we're making progress toward that moonshot and that goal? It's a lot of subsets that you can kind of do from that. I love these kind of things, but each of the 4 components can be broken down then. Here's an economic one. If you're in the pink, you're rocking all 3 components. If you're in the dark orange, you have 3 components. You're below in all the 3 components. And then everywhere in the middle kind of tells you where you have the biggest challenges, neighborhood by neighborhood. So in the yellow, it's mainly a housing issue. In the blue, it's kind of an employment issue. And in the orange areas, it's a combination of poverty and also employment together. So it allows you to become very, very specific to know what some of the challenges that are unique to each of these neighborhoods therefore might be. At the end of the day here, we were just trying to democratize data. We were trying to get all 9 systems looking at the same data in the same way so we can have a new conversation. And we realized, this important fact: if it remains invisible, it remains unsolvable, these types of issues, especially if you're going to work it at the systems level. And we always said it has to be asset-based and appreciative in the way we approach it. We're not here to compare neighborhood to neighborhood, but cultivate each of these block groups to their very fullest potential using this kind of informed approach. These were some of the questions we looked at. Are there particular patterns that we saw across the maps? Are we using analyzed aggregated place-based data like we were before? So that's hiding the information on these variances. And as a team, would we make better decisions and take different actions in different places? And do we now believe that one set of policies at a county level could address those inequities shown on the maps? And how might a place-based approach be different than really the way we're currently organized to do our work? These were the big questions I think that we continually ask ourselves as we look at this data and make some priorities. Speaking of which, once you get the map kind of looking like this, the priorities become a little more prevalent in terms of neighborhoods. We're looking for the darker orange colors and also the greatest absolute number, which those numbers actually represent the number of children that sit within those areas, to begin our prioritization. And that helped our community really begin to focus on very specific neighborhoods with smaller kind of groups of families, the assets that they had in there in terms of schools and other critical resources. But even more importantly, again, relationships. To the bottom right, there are a number of neighborhood partners that already work in these neighborhoods on the ground, many times not even aware that they're working side by side. And so one of our simplest strategies we did is just start convening these place-based organizations providing services, and a strategy we just called Connect the Connectors, and get them together and let them know what kinds of work they're doing in these particular neighborhoods and how they could strengthen their programmatic and service work better, using place as kind of a new lens. We did that because, again, back to our focus, right? The system is the way we all work together. It's a set of relationships, and some of this early relationship building was, I think, a critical footstep into a lot of these neighborhoods. But we still had to go out and talk one-to-one with these communities themselves. And I'm really proud you're all going to get a copy of this guide, Harvard Institute, in addition with United Way National. If you don't, talk to United Way. My guess is they probably have something very similar. They have these tremendous listening guides about how to conduct authentic kinds of experiences and actual voice of the beneficiary within neighborhood by neighborhood. And our teams were actually able to use these to put across a number of listening sessions across the community itself. And again, an asset appreciative based way, even helping them self-organize themselves locally on the ground around some of these listening sessions to decide what changes were going to be most meaningful to them. And that was why we did it. And that was the principle. Transforming a system is ultimately about transforming the relationship. There is no difference between those two things. And then finally, a little bit on the targeted equity approaches here. So the mantra here is we have to ensure equity before we can actually enjoy equality among those various census block groups and neighborhoods. A tremendous body of work here around Latin American, Hispanic work with Tu Futuro, providing mentors, providing counseling, providing community building and events. And to us, it just showed if you focus on a few equity gaps with some discipline, such as high school graduation compared to all students, or actually college enrollment, you can make a profound difference in these variations around this work. I know, Felicia, I know you're on the call. Thank you for all you do. We're doing the same thing now around Black and biracial youth to try to actually move these same metrics in this area. And our community also does the same thing around mental health and trauma-informed care. We actually, in the last election, put on the ballot a referendum to fund mental health counseling in the schools themselves. And believe it or not, it passed. So we have 7 years of funding to support and serve every school building that way actually have to provide critical services using community-based schools in the area. We have a one-page that Amber's going to drop in overview of EquityWorks. So I think it's kind of like a frequently asked question piece. But I think it's more than that, because if you see these links, if you click on any particular question there, it will take you into a pretty good deep dive on any of these kind of topics that I actually covered. The data that we looked at, the way we present the effort, how we actually kind of came about the assessment tool pieces that are available, the listening guides for actually neighborhood engagement, all of that and more is there. In fact, you'll actually see some of the original documents where we actually built the goal tree, read left to right, starting from the moonshot vision and the principles. And front and center, you'll see, there it is. There's the layer cake, from building systems which support place-based strategies, which actually inform targeted equity approaches. And that's how we kind of laid it out for immediate work. But I also think you'll be able to find there, when you're on a 10-year systems change initiative, you owe it to kind of the beneficiaries in the community to kind of say how you think that will kind of unfold over the coming years. So we have it on one page. This is a little bit broader and for your kind of unpacking. But we really laid out what we thought the stages of the moonshot were and how we will actually become the most equitable in each of those areas and how we were going to measure our progress and what outcomes we thought would be different for youth and families as a result of that. We are well past the first stage here, some of the work that you saw, and we're well into the second stage of this work itself. But this has been an invaluable kind of roadmap for us to kind of think about something as huge as a 10-year change initiative and try to really boil it down to something that we can make actionable among a lot of different partners. So how are we doing? Some early stage kind of results. Jerwin Miller was the CEO of Cummins, and Cummins is actually headquartered in Columbus, Indiana. And he was a tremendous leader, but he always pushed us, especially even from the 70s, to say American systems were designed for an age which no longer exists. But, it's our normal preference to rehabilitate the damaged products of the systems rather than reform the systems themselves. But that's where we should be working as leaders. And their damaged products means people. And so one of the catalytic things that we did, I think, was probably most dramatic, is moving from a programmatic model to a systems model in all this work. I don't know how else it could have been done. And these are very different, because a programmatic model, you have lots of people doing lots of things that may or may not necessarily align. It has its own set of principles about solving a problem and giving those problems to individual organizations, which just further can sometimes fragment the work. And if you do that, what do you end up with? A whole bunch of new programs that have to be led, managed, sustained across time. But as a systemic model itself is very different. All the pieces become part of one unifying process. You're there to dissolve problems by redesigning systems themselves. And because you're working on the same system, you can look and see it, the same data, just as we've kind of shown you here today. And if you do that and you really get it right, something I think fundamental happen. You get a fundamental redesign of the work, a fundamental redesign of the relationships. And as we said earlier, if you redesign those relationships, you can redesign systems. I'm pleased to say there have been 3 American community surveys now, updates that have come out. And on the Youth Wellbeing Index, most of the components are trending exactly in the right way across economic, education, health, and family community factors for the youth in the area. And we can now compare ourselves not only locally, but also to the nation. And when Jamie Marisotis wrote his apt book, America Needs Talent, he kind of came up with this idea about talent hubs as a strategy, which are places that are connecting students to economic opportunity. And I know there's some of you on that are talent hubs, and congratulations to you on the line. But let's face it, this is kind of like the Sesame Street. Which one of these things may not belong on this list? Because there's Columbus, Indiana. And the gracious thing is they put Indiana on there, or else everyone would have thought it was Ohio. So we so appreciate that. And a lot of people say, well, why is Columbus on there? Well, let me tell you why I think we might be on there. Due to a lot of the work that's taken place now over almost a quarter century in the area, this report came out last year, which looked at 300 of the top metros that are changing the face of talent and education in the country. It was authored by Dr. Richard Florida, Rise of the Creative Class economist. And if you looked at the top 20 small and medium metros on the growth of college grads over nearly that 10-year period, looking at 2010 to 2019, lo and behold, there's Columbus, Indiana on the top of that list. But I think what also is kind of cool is not only we were the top 20 small and medium metros, we were also ranked #1 out of all 350 metros on that area. And if you have your screen configured so you can't see the fine print, I'll blow that up a little bit for you. We're pretty proud of that number. That was nearly decades in the making and so many partners at the table. But the other thing we're really proud of, and this is why we think equity works, people want to be in more equitable places. And last kind of in 2021, Wall Street Journal ran this article about where America is diversifying the fastest using something called the diversity index, which really just measures the probability of whether or not 2 people, if they meet on the street, will they be representative of the same or different race or ethnicity. So 55% chance is a score of 55, means 55% chance 2 people will have a different race or ethnicity in that. And while the country grew over the past decade, 22% in the diversity index, Columbus, Indiana recorded a 67% gain in that metric, making it again the #1 kind of fastest growing nation to diversify in that area. I don't think those 2 numbers that I gave you are separate by any means or any measure. Equity works because people want to be around equitable places, and equitable places afford more opportunities to people who can actually access the things they need to be successful, to create more economic and other kinds of mobilities that they're looking for in their lives. I'd say this vision wasn't accidental. Jerwin Miller, many years ago, set our community vision, saying we want to be not the cheapest, but the very best community of our size. Now I'm thinking you hopefully see why the EquityWorks vision kind of looks like it's been kind of a chip pulled right off of this block. That's exactly right. He also told us this, excellence is a form of deviance. And if you think about it, that sounds kind of strange on the surface, but if you unpack that a little bit, it's exactly right, because a community becomes excellent because it does things normal places don't want to do. And why do they do them? Because when it comes to the community, and particularly our youth and families, in the apt words of Jerwin Miller, nothing in this world is more expensive itself than mediocrity. So I want to thank you so much for your very, very kind attention on this. Hopefully we gave you some ideas about what we're learning, as a community, but how we're trying to approach it. And we would love to know how you're approaching it and your communities. But also, I think there's just unparalleled results that we can actually make together on this work. And I thank for kind of taking the step with us here today. So Dakota, thank you so much for the kind invitation to be here, and I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, Thank you, Jack. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. We know it's a lot of content, but it's a really impressive body of work that has been underway for a number of years. And for those of you who know CivicLab well, we usually don't bring things to you that haven't been like tested and tried in our own place first. And I would say EquityWorks definitely falls in that category. As we're wrapping up here, I did just put an interest form in the chat. And like I started at the top, we're ready and getting ready to, support other communities or regions or partnerships that want to, mount that same challenge. Like I said earlier in the chat, if you were to say, how might our place become the most equitable, place in the country for this population by this date? If you find yourself, at your next meeting or at a coffee shop talking with other community leaders, kind of circling around that idea, you're our people, and we're really interested and ready to support you. We are talking to a number of our philanthropic partners about being able to invest in a cohort of communities or regions that might want to do that. And so we're collecting early interest of places that said, yeah, we need this kind of equity work. We want, we think we want, wherever you might be on that. Additionally, I'll just say, if you just have some interest around that data visualization work around getting to the census tract data, receiving some of that data book information, we are, as we activate our fellow, interested in providing that kind of service to other communities as a service to you. So take a minute to fill out that interest form. And thank you all for your participation. There's one question in the chat that we didn't answer in the chat just yet. So since I have 2 quick minutes, Jack, Alexis was asking if there was a systems mapping activity with the youth and families that was part of the listening tours that you were doing. So I imagine there was some process as usual to kind of visualize the current state.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. We actually took what we call the youth equity journey. I think you'll see in the outcomes is kind of what we called that. And we actually looked prenatal and all the way through fulfillment of careers. And we actually tried to map across different contexts along that journey. What were the current kind of activities and interactions we were created that were in place to create more equitable experiences, but what was clearly missing? And that clearly found huge gaps along that journey along the way. Many of those, I'm happy to say, are now being, kind of filled in because of that. But yeah, there was a very robust, some would say overly painful exercise using shared Google documents and shared sheets to map that equity journey along that way. But indeed, that was undertaken.
Thank you. All right, everybody. Well, with that, I just put, again, all of our links that we shared today at one last chat in case you didn't have a chance to catch one, or if you joined late or something like that. We encourage you to join us in March for our initiative fatigue session. Check out our 2023 labs if that's of interest. Be sure to sign up for our newsletter, which will be coming out soon. And again, you can get all of our materials at that Dropbox link. I'll just add one other brief thing. You have the slides in that Dropbox link and a one-pager. And as Jack mentioned, but in case you missed it, in that one-pager are several other links to other assets that were mentioned today. So if you're like, wait, I was looking for that tool you mentioned or that survey, go to that one-pager first. There's a lot of links. And if there's something we missed, you know how to get a hold of us. But we're at the hour. Thank you so much for spending it with us. We always appreciate you. And if ever we can be of service, do let us know. Thanks, everybody.